welcome, Professor Collins, to our workshop. It's a real pleasure, and we look forward to this. Professor Miguel Centeno is an old friend of our workshop. I vividly recall that wonderful session we had. Well, my goodness, it's more than a couple of years ago now, Miguel. This is incredible. He's the Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton and Vice Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs there. He's also published widely. It's on war and society, on global capitalism. His classic work, States in the Developing World, has been a standard reference work for me and for all those of us who work in development and in developing society and sociology of development. He's written on state and nation making in the Iberian world, and he's now sort of finishing a project on the sociology of discipline. And it was on this subject that he spoke. He gave that really scintillating discussion at our workshop a couple of years ago. We've got to have him come back and sort of talk again about the outcome, because he had just begun to sort of think about the subject when he spoke to us. He's the founder of the Research Community on Global Systemic Risk, and he has served as head of First College, and is involved with numerous other public intellectual events. So the book, which I'm looking forward, to reading on the consolidation of discipline, is really going to be an extraordinary one. We do not have the time here for me to read all these sort of publications, in addition to the work on development, developing state capacity, war on society, and the classic warfare in Latin America, 2-volume work, which is now considered one of the major, if not the major work on the subject there. So welcome, Miguel, again to our workshop, and we look forward to hearing from you. So let me begin then by asking Daniel to present his work to us, and for about 15-20 minutes or so. So Danilo, please.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the honor of showing up. I should say my heartfelt thanks to everybody involved and for your interest in this somewhat obscure topic, what I would argue is a deeply misunderstood topic, but certainly a topic that is not mainstream social science where it belongs. Everybody tells me that the first book is always the worst one, so I am reasonably optimistic about my next book. I can't guarantee about this one. But I should say that I'm very proud to say that I was one of the founders years ago as a graduate student of the History, Culture, and Society workshop. So I am very grateful to the organizers for the kind of invitation, and it does feel like coming home in many ways. Needless to say, it's also an honor to spend some time with this cast of luminaries that we have with us here today. Orlando Patterson was a formative voice on my committee when this book was in its infancy, or in its pregnancy, we might say, and he was instrumental in making sure that it was not, so to speak, stillborn. I'm especially grateful to Centeno and Collins for taking the time to read the book. I should say that insofar as they agree with things in the book, it's not a coincidence, because I think they will, in a significant sense, be agreeing with themselves. Professor Centeno's work on the organizational dimension of war and the formative impact of war on society that Orlando mentioned is, in my view, a singular contribution to this field, and my book would not have been possible without it. Professor Collins's work on violence and even more on patrimonialism has had a towering influence on my thinking and was my motivation to push this somewhat eccentric topic. Indeed, the book, my book, can be thought of as an elaboration, merely a series of footnotes to Collins's article on patrimonial alliances and state penetration, which obviously opened up the intellectual space for this discussion on gangs and mafias in state making. So the book is an analysis of 16 cases of separatism in West Africa, the Middle East, and East Europe over a period of 30 years. It has a number of arguments which I cannot present here because we don't have that much time, but I would like to give 3 points, 3 brief provocations before we can hear from the discussants. So let me try to state the 3 points as ascetically as I can. Point 1 is, in separatist places, what I call torn states, organized crime is an agent. It is not minor, it is not a symptom, it is not epiphenomenal, it is not a curiosity that we can dispose of in a dismissive footnote in passing. It is not an incoherent entity, nor is it a diffuse phenomenon like corruption. It is not just a fixture of nationalist propaganda. It is not just a byproduct, an unfortunate unintended consequence of ethnic division, for example. It is not just an indicator of other things that matter and deserve causal consideration, like state capacity, or the rule of law, or the level of democratization, or the level of ethnic heterogeneity, or the collapse of centralized economic planning, or whatever it may be. Instead, organized crime is an agent, an intelligible, recognizable actor with an economic as well as a political agenda of governance, and potentially, if the situation is right, a capacity for state making. There are very good, even obvious reasons why mafias would be consequential for separatism. I don't want to sound like some crazy structural functionalist, which is hardly my intention today, but I would like to say that there are deep structural reasons for why mafias are natural players in torn states, and why it is natural for them to be potential allies for both the separatist movement and governments that are resisting such movements. On even the crudest level, consider just a few things that one needs for separatism. So separatist movements need fighters, first of all. Unlike in the Western democracies, most separatist movements in the world become violent sooner or later. As we know very well, insurgent guerrillas and militias often splinter, discipline is difficult, organized violence is very expensive, mass mobilizations don't always work, as we just finished seeing in Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenian experience that is still fresh. And so you have to ask yourself, who has access to military-aged individuals in the locality? Who has restless young men trained in violence who may be thugs for hire? Who has the wherewithal on short notice to recruit violent offenders, including from the prison system, but not just from the prison system, to engage in some kind of collective mobilization? The answer is mafias do. Separatist movements need money. So who has the access to black markets in the locality? Who controls the narcotics profits, for example? Who can extract money from extortion rackets? In an ideal world, voluntary contributions by patriotic sympathizers would be enough for separatist liberation. Sadly, as Kurdish nationalism discovered time and time again, coercive taxation, extortion are often more effective. So who has access to cash flow? Who has access to the liquidity that is not tied to formal state institutions, which might block it for political reasons? Mafias do. Separatism needs weapons. There are embargoes. There's a hesitant patron state, external sponsor. There are international actors that make it very, very difficult to deliver, for example, a fleet of pickup trucks filled with Kalashnikovs. And so you ask yourself, who has access to irregular arms flows into the locality? Who has contacts with regional and global weapons markets? Who is able to be the liaison with the formal weapons industry to secure arms export licenses, to circumvent arms embargoes, to deliver weapons, including to people who are on one or another list of human rights abusers, but perhaps the list is not very fair from the perspective of the nationalist cause. So who has the weapons for separatists to defend themselves? Mafias do. We could go on. Separatism needs to mobilize the civilian population. Most civilians are often very hesitant and perhaps even treacherous in their willingness to stand up and fight for the separatist cause. And then who has patron-client relations with this community? Who has been there in the locality for decades and decades, employing all categories of people in a situation when the formal economy is not very impressive? Who is the major job provider in many separatist regions? Who is the major source of income in an economy that is, say, 80% not white, but black and gray? Who, a community that is now being asked to fight for or against independence? Who has the credibility and the legitimacy in the classic Weberian sense to defend that population from violence? Who is perceived as the most credible side to deliver justice in a territory where the government is not very good at doing justice and may even be terrorizing the population on ethno-national lines? So whose patrimonialism has been delivering goods and services, including protection services, protection from violence, for such a long time that people are willing to sacrifice for this out of loyalty? So who can mobilize the civilians if push comes to shove? Mafias can. Control over borders. Who controls checkpoints in torn states? Who runs the trucks, the drivers, the smuggling operations, the network of customs officers and border guards in disputed territories? Who makes most of the profit on a porous border that is recognized by neither side, but supervised by a dozen overlapping foreign organizations, many of whom have no idea what the hell they're doing there and what to do once they are there? One of the crucial specificities of separatist movements, unlike revolutionary movements, unlike most other insurgencies, is that they are not satisfied with merely replacing one elite with another, with reforming the existing state apparatus, or just seizing it within existing borders. They want their own borders, their own customs booths, their own checkpoints, their own license plates and import-export mechanisms and all the rest of it. So if you are interested in control over separatist borders, you have to think to yourself, well, gee, if only there was somebody who already has the smuggling mechanisms, who has been transporting drugs and migrants across this terrain for decades, for example. If only there was somebody who had a network of bribed customs officers, border guards, multiple license plates, one for the separatist authorities, another for the pretend government, right? If only there was somebody who can transport separatist fighters into safety across the border without anyone noticing. Mafias are there for those things. They are there, they are inside the locality, and their predisposition to aid separatism or not is going to have significant effects on what ends up happening. So much of the book is just trying to draw attention to these kinds of very simple-minded, even primitive observations that I listed for you now, to work out some of the implications of this special agency that mafias are able to acquire in torn states, given the empowerment and given the opportunity that separatism offers them. I am not saying this opportunity and this empowerment exists everywhere, nor am I saying that other things do not create it in non-separatist contexts, but in this particular kind of society, it's very obvious. And then I propose that the best way to understand this mafia agency is a Simmelian triadic form perspective, in which the host state, the separatist movement, and organized crime are part of a triadic relationship, a story of three agents and not just two agents as we typically imagine it. And I can expand on this if time permits later. Point number two, the roles that mafias play in separatist contexts are going to depend on two things. Number one, their level of state dependence, and number two, their level of ethnocentrism. Regarding the first dimension, the level of state dependence, I differentiate between organized crime that is largely controlled, often created, though not always, by host state institutions on the one hand, and mafias that are relatively autonomous from the state in operating their rackets, on the other hand. This, I think, is a very important distinction. This is, of course, a matter of degree. Of course, there is no organized crime without at least some organizational capture, penetration of state institutions. Of course, important qualifications need to be made about how coherent mafia motivations are and about overlapping directorates, to borrow an old phrase, between criminal elites and government elites. Nevertheless, I argue that it makes a world of a difference whether a mafia is predominantly state-dependent or not in these contexts. State-dependent mafias are indispensably patronized by some kind of host state institution, government, military, police, secret service, state enterprises, which sustain their rackets from within the state apparatus. This begins when governments under separatist threat proactively and deliberately reach out into the prison system, into the urban youth gangs, into the bodyguard associations, into the neighborhood extortion rackets, into the sports hooligans clubs, into the soldier boys in northern Nigeria, whatever it may be, who also happen to be drug dealers, right? State reaches out into the various government liaisons with the criminal classes in order to recruit them. They are recruited for everything ranging from surveillance of separatist communities, keeping a finger on the pulse of the separatist territory, so to speak, to propagandizing and intimidating the separatist community, to creating paramilitary groups which serve as battering rams to assassinate separatists, to imprison separatists, to infiltrate separatist organizations, and perhaps even convert some of them with the profit motive. This is the story of Turkey in the 1990s and even early 2000s, in the Susurluk affair. This is the story of Yugoslavia, vis-a-vis not just Bosnia-Herzegovina, but virtually all the wars of Yugoslav collapse. This is the story of that Milosevic regime. This is the story of Azerbaijan, vis-a-vis Nagorno-Karabakh in previous decades, leading up to this recent war that we all read about. And this is partly, to a certain extent, the story of Nigeria in its anti-Boko Haram counterinsurgency in the north. If you read our Nigerian colleagues following the situation up there, it is rather striking to see how vigilante groups like the Bakassi boys and others graduated from being state enemies to being counterinsurgency assets when they were folded into a joint task force to defeat this northern separatist threat in the 2010s. And it's very indicative that people who think the counterinsurgency campaign is a disaster on grounds of brutality, or the people who feel that it's not brutal enough, is inefficient, tend to have, there's a consensus across the different sides that this recruitment of gangs and vigilante groups inside, folding them inside the counterinsurgency, was a very important feature of whether they think it failed or not. They think it was an important feature in that failure or in that success. Now, to be sure, just because mafias emerge or are empowered by the host state does not mean they remain loyal and controllable. On the contrary, they often become loose cannons. The experiences of Bosnia-Herzegovina, of the Houthi rebellion in Yemen, right? Of the war in East Ukraine, the Donetsk and Lugansk story, and to a certain extent Crimea as well. These are all phenomenal examples of state-dependent organized crime that begins to bite the hand that feeds it. Due to state weakness, exogenous shocks like foreign interventions, or just government incompetence, gangsters within the state apparatus begin to smuggle, extort, or profiteer to their own ends. And the most consequential version of this is giving state resources, government weapons in particular, to the separatist enemy, thus undermining the host state's reintegration efforts. My favorite illustration of this is under the Yugoslav civil wars, a dynamic that we see in Yemen, but that we also see in other cases. But my favorite illustration is the notorious Prvi Partizan munitions factory, which means the first partisan is the name of it, in a small town in Serbia at the height of this very serious Yugoslav civil war. This was a state enterprise munitions factory headed by a Milosevic cadre, a guy literally inside his Socialist Party ranks, rank and kind of not some oppositional kind of type. This single factory smuggled over 94 tons of munition to Croatian and Bosniak forces. The Bosniak defense minister struck a deal with the Serbian security apparatus to allow shipments, massive shipments through Bosnia to Serbian positions in Croatia, where the thought was that they're going to be fighting a common foe. So far, so good. But before long, this smuggling network embedded inside this, it takes on a life of its own and undermines not just the Serbian war effort, but on all sides. In effect, Serbian forces were arming their own separatist arch enemy. Bosniak forces were sustaining Serbian militias, all of which appears crazy. And many observers have noted the kind of disjuncture between that and the ethno-nationalist explanatory story, which tended to dominate for a while, right? We have another wonderful illustration of this kind of state-dependent arms smuggling run wild just recently, last month. Like every self-respecting sociologist, whatever I read in the news, I tend to interpret as supporting my argument. So accordingly, last month I was delighted to see that a guy called Oleg Kalashnikov was uncovered in Ukraine in a fascinating recent scandal. His name had to be Kalashnikov. You can't make this up. In the Harvard Lampoon, you couldn't make this up. And the curiosity about Oleg Kalashnikov is that he was the anti-arms trafficking Tsar in a province called Kharkov, a major province in Ukraine. And the beauty is that he, instead of being the anti-arms trafficking Tsar, was revealed to be the arms trafficking Tsar, who was, among other things, smuggling sacrificing Ukrainian co-ethnic, co-nationals, whatever you want to call it, Ukrainian citizens taken hostage by Iraqi Kurdish troops with whom he had a deal for millions of dollars to sell Ukrainian aid to Iraqi Kurdish forces. And once the deal goes sour, you have these Ukrainian hostages who were also part of this racket taken to Ukraine and then returned, celebratory return with Zelensky mediating the hostage release. But only then you discover, like time and again, you discover with many of these episodes that embedded in the state apparatus is this tremendous, tremendous arms racket that is having a real effect on Ukraine's war effort in East Ukraine with the Russian separatists. So these are some state-dependent mafias and illustrations of their significance. Independent mafias, in contrast, though they engage in corrupt government officials, though they do bribery, blackmail, co-optation, of course, they largely operate autonomously of the state and sustain rackets despite, not through, host state institutions. And so the difference between these is the first major dimension that will help us understand separatist outcomes. Regarding the second dimension quickly, I argue that the difference between ethnocentric mafias and those that are less ethnocentric is really critical. Do they take sides in the nationalist dispute, or are they impartial or agnostic about the ethnic division in the society or in the broader region where they're operating? As it turns out, in this clash between two competing nationalisms, between two incompatible political agendas from two different ethnic constituencies, some mafias have very clearly a dog in that fight. Other mafias, however, do not have a dog in that fight and are content to be impartial, and perhaps are even content to oppose ethnic mobilization, to oppose escalation of conflict on the ground of opportunistic and, if you want, predatory, profit-making self-interest. So for reasons that I alluded to earlier, most separatist movements have significant ethnocentric mafias in their corner. Kosovo, Azawad in Mali, Casamance in Senegal, Kurdistan in Iraq, in Turkey rather, excuse me, particularly the Kurdish separatism in Turkey, Daesh or Islamic State, right? Transnistria, Gaza. All of these are cases of organized criminal alliances between separatist movements and mafias, sometimes so firm that gangsters literally become statesmen, government officials. They become legal and legitimate representatives of their ethno-national community. These pro-separatist mafias were firmly rooted in minority ethnic communities, ethnic in the broadest sense of the term, and their criminal racket serviced the separatist cause at the expense of the host state. Interestingly, however, there are also impartial, non-ethnocentric mafias that have a very different dynamic and that produce different outcomes. Far from stoking conflict, these organized criminals, excuse me, this is of course the Zoom. I do apologize. So I was just ending the pitch for the importance of the level of ethnocentrism with the point that some mafias are in the business of securing supply for a multi-ethnic demand for security, for employment, for contraband, and for protection to both sides of the separatist division. I call these cosmopolitan mafias, for better or for worse, but the key about them is that they are multi-ethnic in composition, and they specialize in smuggling transnationally across polarized populations. And the greatest example of this is the Ergneti market in South Ossetia and Georgia, where I did field work. Between the first and second South Ossetia wars, Ergneti was a spectacular force for multi-ethnic reconciliation. And it's a very interesting case study of how cracking down on organized crime can in fact rekindle separatist violence, nationalist violence, because destroying the mafia, smuggling, and the mafia enterprises removes the only true force for ethnic reconciliation and peace building. Mafias, in other words, can be very effective peace builders across ethnically divided communities, as ironic as that sounds. So it is a tremendous shame that the Georgian host state under Saakashvili decided to crack down on Ergneti, because in so doing, they removed the single greatest force integrating Ossetians and Georgians on the ground. This is not an argument about romanticizing criminal psychopaths. This is not a story about how these are noble forces to be supported, but it's a story about how unintended consequences should be taken into consideration in relation to whether the mafia is ethnocentric or not. So to repeat, the two things that matter about organized crime in these contexts is one, how state dependent it is, and two, how ethnocentric it is. If we can analyze these two features of mafias, admittedly a big if, a formidable methodological problem, and I am second to none in admitting that, if that's possible, I argue that you are on a very good path to understanding separatism. In the book, I offer a 2x2 typology that results from these two dimensions, and I believe this typology can fruitfully be used in other separatist contexts and would give a much fuller explanatory account than we usually get of a lot of. Point 3, my third and final provocation. Let me see how I'm doing on time. So very briefly, my third point is a more methodological one, which is that the reason we should study mafias vis-a-vis separatism is because we can. Much of sociology, and not just sociology, but economics, anthropology, and even criminology, has shied away from the question of organized crime in ethnically torn places, mostly on the grounds of methodological difficulties. The effect has been to cede the field to propagandists who use organized crime as a slur to delegitimize one nationalism or another, or one government or another. The effect has been to cede the field to mystifications about mafias, the sensationalism, the glamour, the fetishization of violence. Worst of all, perhaps, the effect has been to cede the field to non-sociologists who have different standards. And so this neglect is partly understandable. It is extremely difficult to quantify almost anything when it comes to mafias. Seizure data of narcotics are useless. Statistics bureaus on organized crime are problematic and tendentious. Smuggling volumes are imprecise estimates. Mafia's organizational structure is very, very difficult to know a lot of times. I myself spent several very difficult years in Kosovo and South Ossetia, desperately pursuing anything that is firm, that can be considered evidence And I am second to none in understanding how impossible it is to get easy answers and to get clean data about the effect of gangsters on nationalist movements and mafias. Disaggregating the garbage from the evidence is a full-time job, and a job for entire research institutes. And it is much more time consuming to study youth gangs around Boko Haram in northern Nigeria or Hamas tunnelers in Gaza, like Sarah Roy has done from Harvard. It's a lot more difficult to do that than it is to study gangs in inner city Chicago or drug dealers in Brooklyn. So the neglect is understandable. However, it is also true that there are excellent and illuminating documents for content analysis and for synthesis across different sources, which is what I try to do. The notion that mafias are impenetrable, too mysterious, too elusive, too imprecise to study is not correct anymore, if it ever was. There are excellent archival materials which paint a very precise picture of the organizational chart of many mafias, not always, but often very, very precise pictures of their impact. In Turkey, notably, you have over 10,000 pages of testimonies, court documents, translated into English as a result of the Susurluk affair, that tell the story of Kurdish separatism and its enemies with sometimes greater detail than we have about the decision-making process within a normal government, within a normal state apparatus. In Yugoslavia, notably, the Hague Tribunal alone has produced a gargantuan archive, a word-searchable archive that is bigger than any human being can read in a lifetime. And it includes a welter of firm evidence on mafia's role in the Yugoslav separatist stories, including better ones than, more so than we have transcripts of the political leaderships in the respective republics. There are excellent memoirs from different sides of each separatist divide which converge on the recollections of what organized crime did and did not do, from military officers, from gangsters themselves, obviously, from hostages of gangsters, from separatist leaders, from political figures. There are excellent on-the-ground ethnographic accounts of major episodes of mafia impact on separatist trajectories from anthropologists, from journalists, from NGO people, which are done in real time, prospectively, and not retrospectively after the fact, after the war, when one or another narrative tends to congeal. Finally, for better or for worse, there are specialized experts, as I have discovered, who have been judiciously following all manner of global trafficking since the Cold War. There is the UNODC, for better or for worse, which is a wonderful institution because it's completely toothless. The UNODC, the UN Office of Drugs and Corruption. And the beauty is that because it has no power, therefore, many government and mafia officials around the world are willing to tell UNODC analysts all sorts of information that they would not tell anyone else. One of my favorite informants or favorite expert interviews, series of interviews I did, was with a UNODC head of analysis, head of analytics for the Middle East and Africa. And this no-nonsense security person, a veteran kind of security interrogator, a man who has interrogated hundreds of gangsters, terrorists, warlords, anybody who's anybody in the 2 to 3 regions this guy has interrogated. And so when he indicates, for example, that the recent coup that happened in Mali was very much a criminal turf war over smuggling, and if this judgment of his is against his institution's official position, that might be a valuable perspective. This is a guy who every morning for 30 years gets in his mailbox dozens and dozens of reports that are not declassified and available to any of us. And he is able to disaggregate, for example, what is Algerian intelligence services propaganda about who's a gangster and who's not, and what might actually be true. So this is just an illustration of how expert interviews over and above this other stuff, when people like that make a judgment about how central mafias are, this can also be one of the ways to evaluate the quality of data elsewhere. So to wrap up, it is possible on that methodological third point to diversify the range of sources to combine and double check different pieces of evidence, to discover the signal from the noise, and ultimately to extract pieces of evidence of the bigger trends, however imperfectly, all the while avoiding the pitfalls of over-criminalizing and the political pitfall of stigmatizing nationalist grievances. With those 3 points, I thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing I hope some of you are kind enough to buy the book, because I'm confident that you will see how much more the book is persuasive than I am persuasive on Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danilo. That was wonderful. And so let's move right into Professor Randall Collins's comments. Professor Collins, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Mandić's innovation is to show that success or failure of separatist movements depends on a three-way relation, not just among state and separatists, but also organized crime. My comments will focus on the third part of the triad. First, the economic side of organized crime. It is in it for the money and in a sustainable way. It makes money in four main ways. One, by collecting on protection or extortion upon illegal or legal goods and services. This tends to be locally unpopular if the targets are legal, but tolerated or popular if they are illegal. Two, trading in stolen property. This is unpopular if the stealing is local, but tolerated if stolen goods are imported from elsewhere. Three, producing and distributing illegal goods and services themselves. Four, smuggling any of the above. Numbers 3 and 4 are locally popular if much wanted goods are smuggled into the locality. The exception is when crime orgs fight turf wars among themselves, which leaves too many people on the wrong side of a protection arrangement, as well as a lot of casualties among bystanders. Kidnapping for ransom, sex workers, and other kinds of slavery is an extreme form of extortion. These are very unpopular locally unless targeted at outsiders. The bedrock of organized crime traditionally is protection of illegal goods, but extending to all legal goods and activities in areas where weak state penetration provides no legal enforcement. Classically, this is the Sicilian Mafia. But in Mandić's cases, smuggling and black markets include such normally legal goods as wheat, food, soap, timber, gasoline, and oil. What makes them illegal? State action, including embargoes and sanctions against enemy or rogue regimes. High taxes to evade, such as cigarettes. Outlawing counterfeits and brand name violations. Price controls and green-oriented environmental restrictions. The economic basis of organized crime would be eroded by legalization, not just of so-called vices, but especially if states cut back on sanctions, sales taxes, price controls, and virtuous crusades to limit production and consumption. This should remind us that the coming of strict environmentalist regimes in the future will generate black markets and protection, not just in poor countries with weak state penetration, but in the liberal heartlands of the world economy. If this sounds sardonic, it is sociologists' job to be realistic. Idealistic state policies enforced by prohibitions have unintended consequences, and showing this is a major part of Mandić's book. The main point is that crime orgs have an interest in prolonging the situations that make so many goods illegal, unobtainable, or in need of protection. Thus, on the whole, they are in favor of stalemated or low-level war and prolonged state breakdown. Turn now to the political side of organized crime. It's confusing to use the term mafia to cover all kinds of crime organizations. The ideal type 5 families of the New York Mafia was a diplomatic council, not a hierarchy. It called itself the Peace Commission. It settled jurisdictional disputes and enforce rules to avoid internal wars and police crackdowns under penalty of assassination or authorized by the commission. Each family had a pyramid of operating subfamilies, the heads of which were ratified by the council. But the political structure at all levels was only a political umbrella, providing internal enforcement while leaving economic aspects of crime to ad hoc activities of its members. Mafia soldiers at all ranks could run protection rackets as well as ad hoc thefts and scams in little crews formed for the purpose. The political umbrella was hierarchic only in demanding a portion of the economic take be passed along to the higher ranks, a version of internal protection or taxation, whichever analytical vocabulary you prefer. If we reserve the term mafia for this protection umbrella, we will see many other kinds of cases and many other kinds of structures in Mandić's cases. A few, which are much more hierarchic, with an absolute kingpin who seemingly controls all economic crime and has rigid enforcement over all subordinates. I suspect this is something of a myth. Some structures are horizontal relations among big clans, with ambiguity as to whether they are purposely formed crime orgs or pre-existing pseudo-kinship groupings. Such clans could be violent rivals, or turf-dividing cartels, or possibly even a mafia-style diplomatic peace council. At a smaller scale, there are medium-sized crime orgs whose members engage in various kinds of profitable crime and carry out their political relationships by intimidation, violence, or bribery. Mandić provides little information on the range of structures, with a tendency to quote from sources that use melodramatic rhetoric about how fearsome and all-powerful they are, but this leaves open the question of how much is done by ad hoc crews and how much coordination there is from above. One might think that large-scale smuggling would have to be highly coordinated, but a large, highly centralized organization is precarious, subject to decapitation either by the state or by rivals. In fact, most smuggling chains are very decentralized. Numerous local entrepreneurs spring up along 1,000-mile routes of transporting migrants, drug smuggling across obscure borders, or through high-tech checkpoints, are usually farmed out to local mules or low-level risk takers. The tendency by journalists and agencies to throw around huge numbers of these supposed street value of drugs that cross a particular territory gives a false mode of what mode of organization carries it out. Big dollar numbers do not mean big organization. Similarly, trade by hostile troops across front lines, especially on static fronts like a siege, has been documented in armies since the Napoleonic Wars, and including the US Civil War. It needs no organization beyond their own logistics chains. Trades of cigarettes, food, or even their own arms are the traders of cigarettes, food, or even their own arms are the soldiers themselves. In a very corrupt army like Iraq's that disintegrated in the ISIS offensive of 2016, officers also sell off weapons, fuel, and supplies. What crime orgs can bring to a stalemated front is chiefly additional logistics chains to the frontline traders. What difference does it make how crime orgs are structured? This is an aspect of Mandić's research that requires further work. We know from the stories he tells that some famous criminals are arrested or assassinated. Also that they escape, presumably through bribery and backup. Sometimes they become high government officials in volatile states or enclaves. Sometimes they are overthrown. The range of their career length and success needs to be compared and its correlates discovered. The longest lasting crime org careers known to me are some of the heads of the New York.
Page 2 of 6. Under the, about the.
Oops.
In addition to plans.
Are we losing the vocal here?
No, I'm not quite sure what that is.
Attempt, and he's just saying, or assist, but they're saying that there should be some sort of guarantee that you would obtain it.
I think that's an outside.
And if not, what happens?
Yeah, when and
I'm sorry, Orlando. I think Arnaldo Sanchez, you keep coming up as a speaker when that comes on, so it might be interference from you.
from me,
No, not from Arnaldo Sanchez. His image kept coming up. I think he shut it off.
okay, all right.
All right.
Sorry about that, Professor.
Okay here?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Yeah,
Okay,
continue,
good.
please.
I'll try and pick it up again. The longest lasting crime org careers known to me are some of the heads of the New York Mafia 5 families, lasting for several decades. This was within a peacekeeping diplomatic structure with great decentralization at the economic crime level. That it also operated inside a strong state, undisturbed by civil war, implies that crime orgs in war-torn zones would be much more short-lived. Finally, what effects do crime orgs have on separatist movements? Of Mandić's 16 cases, 4 became successful separatist neo-states. Most successful is Transnistria, which inherited a huge Soviet arms depot and munitions factories. It helped being on a border region between Moldova, a very poor and weak state, and the Ukraine, likewise eager to supply the international arms market from its sole asset, military stockpiles. Geopolitical factors similarly made Bosnia and Kosovo independent states in the war settlement imposed by external great powers in the breakup of Yugoslavia, triggered by the collapse of the USSR. And the quasi-states of the eastern Ukraine are products of Russian intervention. Russia used pre-existing crime orgs to camouflage its action. So-called mafias in uniform are not so much evidence of the importance of crime orgs in deciding success or failure, but a tool that authoritarian governments use to repress opponents where official forces would be embarrassing. Mubarak used them at Tahrir Square in 2011 when his army wavered to the crowd's emotional appeal, chanting, "The army and the people are one hand." But relying on crime orgs as enforcers weakens a state in the long run. It didn't work for Mubarak when the army turned against the enforcers. 3 more cases were temporary or ephemeral successes as independent enclaves. Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous Armenian population area within Azerbaijan, maintained its autonomy until external forces, both from the Islamic Middle East and shifting Russian strategies, laid it open to Azeri conquest in late 2020, which is beyond the scope of Mandić's book. South Ossetia on the Russian-Georgian border had a period of de facto autonomy with a thriving border smuggling area, openly transmitting needed goods in both directions. It was notable also for ignoring ideologies of ethnic hostility in favor of making an island of prosperity in the midst of privation. But military and external state polities were the prime mover, as we can see, because the multi-ethnic black market flourished only when the conflict was frozen and ethnic crusades returned when Georgia cracked down. Also in this ephemeral group is ISIS, which carved out a considerable state-like territory, taking advantage of the unstable multi-sided military situation in Syria and self-defeating arms sales by the abundantly US supplied Iraqi army. In fact, ISIS attempted to act much more like a legitimate state than the other cases, with hierarchy and discipline, taxing subjects, but providing public services. Criminal elements joined ISIS, but this seems not to have been a great element in their success. In any case, acting like a legitimate territorial state instead of hiding like a guerrilla army is a liability in warfare. US forces and their proxies were able to carry out conventional warfare and rapidly turn ISIS back into Daesh. One succession movement was a complete failure, the English-speaking minority in Cameroon. It also had no organized crime, which is some evidence of importance for separatist success. 4 cases are running sores, ongoing minor stalemates with autonomous crime orgs in remote regions of Nigeria, especially Boko Haram, Tuareg nomads in the deserts of Mali and Niger, and a region in Senegal largely cut off by the intervening territory of Gambia. Ethnic and religious identities figure in some of these crime orgs, but on the whole, they take advantages of opportunities for trafficking of arms, migrants, etc., in long-distance chains, which are necessarily multi-ethnic at their interstices. Boko Haram stands out as engaging in large-scale kidnapping for ransom under the camouflage of Islamic militancy. It is doubtful this would survive without indirect state funding via their ransom operation. Finally, there are 4 cases of frozen conflict, large-scale, well-organized, and well-supplied military forces or movements. Their existence is due mainly to geopolitics. Gaza is an externally created enclave between Israel and Egypt. Its economy depends on smuggling tunnels, giving a slant towards organized crime. Here, state sanctions and diplomatic pressure sustain crime orgs and undermine the original impetus of Hamas ideologues to clean up local predators. Yemen has a 50-year history of civil wars and fragmented regimes, plenty of criminal organization, but the key factor is external, arms suppliers in neighboring states. Kurdistan is a national product spread among 4 major states. It was long sustained by crime orgs, but also benefited temporarily by its militancy, by its more highly committed military organization, and hence its usefulness as a proxy for US troops in Syria. Being a multi-sided chaos, Syria being a multi-sided chaos in the technical sense of the term, too many forces and too many arms suppliers to be deterministic or stable. Hence, Syria is a favorable geopolitical environment for de facto separatist movements. Most of them, taking the cosmopolitan opportunistic path, are doomed to be ephemeral. It is suggestive that the Kurds, a movement that has more to it than organized crime, seems to have much more long-term sustainability. The biggest common denominator of all these cases is that they are fragments of former empires of conquest, the Ottoman, Russian, Soviet, and the British and French colonial empires. The empires themselves, plus the independence struggles, resulted in multi-ethnic, multi-religious mishmash. Weak state penetration in the first place was made worse by contentious politics and rebellions in successor states. Crime orgs flourish in this context, above all for the economic opportunities and cash flows they provide where state infrastructure is lacking. As I noted earlier, smuggling and illegal goods are usually popular with the local population, but protection, extortion, and theft usually are not popular. Can we have one without the other? Smuggling and illegal goods can be eliminated if states change their policies. Some aspects of protection and government correction decline when fewer things are made illegal. But that leaves extortion, theft, and violent turf wars, which may well increase as existing crime orgs turn to other sources of income, as we see with the so-called cartels of Mexico. I say so-called because they don't act like cartels, but invade each other's turf. We can ask, finally, whether the opportunism of profit-oriented crime organizations promotes the transcendence of ethnic identities, resulting in cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic organization, and hence in the long run is a step towards state building. But as we have seen, most organized crime uses multi-ethnic contacts and temporary alliances at its interstices. Even the strict Sicilian-based New York Mafia, for its dispersed economic gigs, formed ad hoc crews for ethnic outsiders. Higher up, it used notorious Jewish organizations for hitmen and others for money laundering. In other words, on the economic side, most crime organizations are relatively dispersed. The political side of it is one that's centralized, and I have the strong suspicion that the politically centralized part of it is more ethnically exclusive. These kinds of inter-ethnic exchanges are even more common in long-distance smuggling and, of course, in trading across a stalemated battlefront. Most of the multi-ethnic aspect happens at the lowest level on a case-by-case basis. It remains to be demonstrated that multi-ethnic membership exists higher up in the political umbrella of crime orgs, or indeed how much of a structured hierarchy various crime orgs actually have. It is tempting to think that a cosmopolitan brotherhood in crime is a step towards a post-ethnic world. But given that crime orgs flourish in the places where states are weakest and protection from violence is also an ingredient for more violence, I think it is more of a circular relationship than a way out. Thanks again to Danilo for the book and doing the research. It's apparent that it's a great step, and I think there's further steps to be taken.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins. And well, let's move straight to Professor Centeno. Miguel, please.
Of course, I was muted. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Randy, for going to make me look bad after that. So Danilo's to be congratulated for writing a great book. This was such a fun book to read, and one often does not say that about sociology. Sometimes I felt I was in an Alan First novel or Eric Ambler. You can just imagine, Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet sort of meeting, making these deals, while Danilo, played by Humphrey Bogart, of course, sort of watches and smokes and observes. So you should be congratulated on a really excellent field work in a very hostile context. I have to say, if I had been on your committee, I would have said to you when you proposed this, "Are you nuts? These are nasty people that you're talking to." But so I congratulate your courage. Second, you have some really great points to make, and let me just go from these for more topic specific to general, and then I'm going to follow this up with some questions, sort of chronological questions that came up for me as I was reading the book. First, and I think this is one of your major points, and I think it's so important, we cannot dismiss the role of organized crime in separatist movements. And I would add in small wars of any sort. I sometimes wonder about the separatist element as a category for your political movement. Does it have to be separatist, or is it really about territorial control? And it could be, and you'll see where this goes in a little bit. Now, you say that for these kinds of small wars, organized crime is natural. Well, I'm wondering also, are small wars natural in an organized crime? And this goes back to the issue that I would push you on the chicken and egg. But we'll get to that. I mean, does organized crime produce these kinds of movements, or do these kinds of movements produce the opportunity for organized crime, or is it always going to be a different causal order depending on the context? I think, but you do prove that in terms of the players involved and the resources needed, organized crime is a critical component. But what are the alternatives to organized crime as tools? Organized crime seems to be the one that your guys have used, but are there other alternatives? And with that in mind, I was wondering where you would fit this in the sort of the resource curse literature, where you create a resource that can actually fuel an opposition political movement, and usually it's diamonds or oil cells. In your case, it's control, or in many of the cases, it's control over smuggling routes. Is that a version of a resource course? You also demonstrate that when looking at political movements, it makes sense to be as granular as possible. I think we've gone way too structural in sort of our structural agency debates when we talk about politics, and we have to return some agency and some of that element of granularity, that these relationships, the rise, this charisma, et cetera, might be ephemeral, and that we shouldn't, you can't understand, for example, this is not so much a separatist, but can you really understand post-1990 Yugoslavia without the rhetorical gifts of Milosevic and his ability to touch the right buttons? And I think you return that back, you bring individuals back. into something. You also nicely cross the boundary between what we might call political and market logics. The two get separated sometimes. It's like, well, this is a political decision and this is an economic or a market decision. But you show that the market is a political creation. You wouldn't have this market if it were not for these political situations, and that politics relies on market forces. That this division, in a sense, that between the market and the state, or self-gain and political control, or whatever, that separation is really not very tenable. Certainly in cases like this. You also make an important contribution to understanding how fundamental violence and the control thereof is to political order. I think this is something that anyone who has been raised in the OECD, we forget the violence that's often, one or two screens behind what seem to be very pacific institutions. And cases like the ones you study go, no, in the end, it's about a bunch of guys with machine guns. And these guys with machine guns can make all the difference. Now, they could be wearing uniforms and have flags or whatever, but it's in the end, it's who has the machine guns and who does not. Fidel Castro, when he disarmed one of the other revolutionary groups in 1959, used to say, "Armas para qué? ¿Para qué quieren armas? Why would they want weapons?" Well, you want weapons because in the end, when it comes down to it, it's often that control of that daily violence of the weapons that matter. Finally, you nicely really point out the contradictions between Westphalian political conceits and globalization. You say, look, if it's all, we shouldn't be seeing this separatist movement. There seems to be a paradox or a contradiction with globalization. And I think you pick it up exactly. Globalization is about non-territorial claims to authority in one form or another, or non-territorial based claims to power. And the Westphalian state is very much about territory and power. And one of the things we have to deal with globalization, and COVID has been a perfect example of this, of the distribution of the vaccines, et cetera, is you have these global issues and you have these global phenomena, but our authority is still defined by these very anachronistic notion of frontiers. And your case is perfectly illustrative of that globalization, the demands, the supply and demands of globalizations can start challenging the solidity of these apparently territorially based states. But again, the centrality of violence, I have been arguing, and I know with Randy, he's on my side, that sociology, especially American sociology, but Western, let's say OECD sociology, tends to neglect violence. It's like, where do you see violence? Well, it's there. It's there whether it's hidden or not, and you show very nicely how it's not hidden. Now I'm just going to go through the book and give you a set of questions that I came up with as I was reading it. One comment, the one thing I would eliminate from the book, and I hope I'm not disparaging anybody by saying this, I hate the notion of process tracing. Process tracing sounds to me like path dependency. It's called history. It's called narrative. I don't think you need that whole process tracing thing in the book. But that's just my bias against calling things, something when they're not. Okay, so let me just go through some comments about that I thought about as I was reading the book. First of all, how contextual is the link between separatism and mafias? That is, and this is where the chicken and egg question comes in. Which conditions come first? Do mafias produce these separatist movements? You seem to indicate that separatist movements, if anything, produce these mafias. What's the causal order? Or is there never going to be a universalistic, deterministic causal order? It really depends very much on each case. And it can be, from the makeup of the makeup of the power centers in a particular valley, etc. I can think of many separatist movements. And again, a broader question, are you talking, how important is the separatism to this? Could you have the same thing in small wars that seem to be more ideologically motivated? Because you deal with separatism, ethnicity becomes the central role, and I'm wondering if how that plays out. But I can think of lots of separatist movements that do not have a link to organized crime. I mean, the most obvious are, as far as I know, but who knows what I know, there is no such case for a link with organized crime and separatist movements in Catalonia. Well, in the Basque country, there was violence, but ETA was never sort of a profit-making enterprise as far as I know. Corsica. I think I kept thinking, where's Corsica and all that? Because if from what I understand, there's one case for the independence movement and what we might call nefarious economic institutions co-play. Then there's even more interesting. There are drug cartels that don't bother with separatism. And maybe I've made too much of my professional living showing how Latin America is different from everywhere else, but you don't see this kind of link between criminal enterprises and separatism in Latin America. There is no Sinaloan nationalist pretensions. In Colombia, I mean, there in Colombia is really interesting. You know, there you have clearly a link between a political movement leading, I wouldn't call it a separatist, but an ideological small war insurgency and criminal enterprise. So how do you explain why some separatists end up with this kind of stuff? Or again, how do you explain the causal link between these two? Another question is the question of organizational complexity and hierarchy in these. I would have loved to have shown, and I don't know how you would measure this, how Weberian, if you will, are these separatist movements and these criminal instances. Do they operate via the kind of classic bureaucratic hierarchies? Is there organization? Is there institutionalization? Or are these very, very ephemeral? And I think that's really also going to be very important, that if you're dealing with ephemeral separatist movements or ephemeral organized crime, you can have a very different institution or a very different situation than if you've had ones that have developed over 20 or 30 or 40 years. I mean, one of the reasons, and you point this in the book, that one of the reasons that the Georgian organized crime was so critical is that it started way before 1990. Georgia was a center of organized crime in the former Soviet Union. Do you see the establishment of organizational complexity over time? Do you see the establishment of hierarchy? How much, to use a phrase from an ex-colleague, how much institutional isomorphism? Do these guys look around and say, oh, wow, I see they're doing this. We should be doing this. Is there a separatist or an outlaw guidebook, in a sense, that they go to? And they say, oh, okay, we're going to have this. Are all mafias or separatist movements similarly organized? And I would love for you to have created another variable, in a sense, of different kinds of organizations, ones with more formal authority or informal. You know, there's lots of possible variables on that. Wait a second. Did I just skip? I might have just skipped a page of questions. No, okay. One thing you talked about in your talk that's not really alluded to too much in the book is the identity claims and how do they match with the supposed universality of markets. I mean, one of the standard tropes of capitalism is that it's very democratic. You know, we're too busy making money to hate each other. So if somebody wants to buy my cigarettes, I'll sell them my cigarettes. But does that break down? What are the borders of that? Oh, no, the separatist movement is willing to accept your money that you get from shipping cigarettes, but if you start selling cigarettes to the other side, then they get mad. Or look, anything that makes money is okay. On page 35, you have this wonderful table of dependence and independence from states. and yet these, and it's very much like the ethno-separatism. You treat these categories as static, and I'm wondering if they're dynamic, that this relationship of dependence or independence from the state goes through cycles. You know, and I love the idea of when these movements get out of hand. And I kept thinking, because of what we've been living through in the United States the last a couple of months, how very much, you know, the similarity between this and the GOP creating a political movement that it can no longer control. And it's like, oh dear, what do we do with these guys? And talk a little bit about the dynamics of how social movement or a political movement can become more powerful than the state. And what do you do when you've got organized crime basically masquerading as a separatist movement? You tend to, in the book, it seems you take claims to be a separatist movement at face value. And I wonder, I mean, you and I have had many conversations about our favorite personages from the 90s Yugoslavian war. Arkan. Was Arkan purely organized crime, or was he a political actor? And how do these guys change their hats, depending? I also was reading about the KLA. I would love to, I remember in the late 1990s, a colleague of mine wrote a column in the New York Times saying that the United States should arm the KLA, because the KLA was going to support some kind of order in Kosovo. And I was wondering, would some kind, if you gave some external legitimacy and some external resources to a separatist movement, does that break the link to organized crime, or is it just, you know, you still have it? Again, just a couple more questions. How are borders between control zones policed? I mean, a lot of these, especially many of these organized crimes are really about control of regional markets. This is where I'm allowed to sell weed. This is where you're allowed to sell cigarettes. This is where you pick up the garbage, etc. How do these territorial claims get fixed, and how are they policed with a separatist movement? And along those lines, should we distinguish between what I might call entrepot organized crime, that is producing and selling a product for the outside, and more domestic crime, organized crime, that's really about controlling a demand niche, that's controlling about, well, only I get to sell cigarettes here, or only I get to extort, as opposed to organized crime that is really about producing some good and sending it out. It's almost like, I thought about this last night as I was writing this, you know, is there an exporter model, and is there an import substitution model for organized crime? Or in one, you're just trying to close off your area from anybody else coming in. And the other one, you're just trying to get the stuff out. Finally, just a couple of thoughts on individual cases. Boko Haram, is it really, I mean, you're dismissive of the Islamic claims. I was kind of, I would love to hear more about that. If you really do believe that this is all a patina that they have on this, and there's nothing to it. When you talked about Gaza, I thought a follow-up article from this book that only you could do, maybe with an alliance with an Israeli or a Palestinian colleague, to look at organized crime and the roles in Gaza and in the West Bank. And here you have two very different state capacity models. I mean, Hamas is, you know, if Hamas says the water is going to flow, the water flows. If Hamas says the electricity is going to go, the electricity goes. Palestinian Authority is much weaker. Do you see a different kind of organized crime developing in the two? With Yemen, one of the greatest tragedies, at what point does the chaos start hurting business? Is there a point when these cot smugglers or whatever, you know, start saying, hey man, these Houthis, they're out of control. I mean, one thing is to do this, but you're interfering in my business. I can, you know, we're not getting tourists anymore on our beaches or whatever it might be. And what about that line? Finally, it's just the role of violence in your analysis. You, like me, we're Hobbesian. We see violence everywhere. Do you do you see, there's almost a physical, a nature abhors a vacuum? Does political nature abhor the absence of a monopoly of violence? and you're always going to try to fill that in. In the end, just wonderful read. Congratulations on a great book. I think you can sell this to Hollywood. I want to play the king of cigarette smuggling of the Adriatic, okay? But you've done a beautiful book, and it teaches a lot. And I think it's going to be in any political sociology book, any political sociology course that takes itself seriously and takes violence seriously. This is going to be a required read. Congrats.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. And Danilo, did you want to take 5 brief minutes to respond, or would you prefer if we went straight into the Q&A?
I might take 5 minutes to respond,
Okay.
to thank the discussants mostly. I'm really, as I mentioned at the outset, I am so indebted to their work that when I'm reading Collins and Centeno, and then I find something that I disagree with, my first reaction is to go lie down until I've recovered my senses, as it were. And so a lot of these disagreements are so valuable, I would need more time to go through them, but maybe very quickly. First of all, most of the objections, I think, can be absorbed into the argument without any they are not objections as they sounded, because I think a lot of it is the terminological stuff. Yes, I plead guilty to using this stupid term process tracing. Yes, I plead guilty to using the term mafia interchangeably with organized criminal so-and-so, which may be an unfortunate choice or not. There are several issues that are more terminological, matters of definition, matters of scope, and not about the substance. Let me go in reverse order very quickly. Hobbesian violent world, absolutely, with the crucial proviso that I am not as singularly focused on the violence as an outcome variable as a lot of this school of thought that you're referring to is. I think there's a severe problem about episodes of violence which receive 80% of the attention in the secondary sources, because that's when the books and the journalists and everybody floods in, and it's attractive, salient, sexy episode like this Nagorno-Karabakh thing, and very little attention paid to to periods between wars or to the decades preluded war and things like that. And so a lot of stuff on the Kosovo War beginning in late 1998, not nearly enough on the episode prior to the Kosovo War in 96 and 97, which was in fact the critical juncture that empowered the KLA that you mentioned to ascend to the kinds of insurgency that empowered the KLA to eliminate rivals in order to even become a significant player, in order to even have the capacity to attract international military intervention and support, which gets overwhelmingly the attention, but we neglect the prelude. So with that qualification, yes, the violence. Gaza versus West Bank is something that I mentioned, but you are certainly correct that it's an interesting and important divergence. I think the Gaza story is important because there is a misconception that Hamas, in the beginning, Hamas created the tunneling and the smuggling economy and then used it to defend itself against the Israeli Operation Cast Lead and so on. The real story is that Hamas came in after the fact onto an organized criminal enterprise that was pre-existing and that emerged out of a particular situation that I go out of. So the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority is obviously very different from that. Boko Haram, I didn't put it quite as dismissively as you mentioned, so I am not entirely discounting the ideological religious component, but I am going far enough to say that, to mention my favorite, I don't know why he's on my mind so much, but this guy that I spoke to who interviewed dozens and dozens of these Boko Haram kids, and I asked him, what struck you about these? He says, these are the poorest terrorists I have ever met. And I said, what do you mean? He's talking to Boko Haram kids, including one that chopped off his own father's head. He beheaded his own father. 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, northern Nigeria, gangs, youth gangs recruited by Boko Haram. He says, what strikes you about them? What struck me about them, they're the poorest terrorists I've ever met. They go around 3-4 days not eating anything. They don't eat anything for 3, 4, 5 days. And then they go do a robbery. They go take a hostage. They go, right? And then they get, all the while, they're taking synthetic drugs that are given to them. I forget their name, that is very, and so what stands out, that's the story that we don't necessarily hear as much in how they describe their own participation, how they got recruited, how this gang was centralized under some Boko Haram movement in the north, is a story that we have sacrificed at the expense of the Islamic over focus on the sectarian story and the ideology. But otherwise, you're completely right. Export-oriented versus domestic market type mafias. I agree with you 100%. I describe this in slightly different, this is a terminological thing, I believe. I devote a whole chapter arguing that the key thing in all these indicators of organized crime that we usually, and smuggling, that we usually deal with, the key thing that's missing is, are they concentrated on separatist territory or are they concentrated on host state territory? That, I think, includes your objection about, and the importance of whether certain rackets are external or focused on domestic. The revolving door between politics and organized crime is indeed a thing. You mentioned Arkan. I can mention a whole slew of examples. Samuel Babayan, warlord to gangster to separatist leader. Peker, Sedat Peker. You can talk about Mokhtar Bel Mokhtar. You can talk about a whole slew of people making this transition in a way that we're not necessarily accustomed to seeing in the Western fancy democracies like Spain, Canada, Quebec. You mentioned Basque country. You mentioned ETA and the rest of it. Very, very different. Static versus dynamic separatist snapshot, particularly in the typology of mafias that you kindly mentioned. I am certainly not crazy, and you are right that these are not meant to be static. I would say the dynamism comes from the paired comparison of Serbia and Georgia, where I show, apropos the chicken and egg problem, I show how they are influencing each other in relation to the changing triadic form. So it matters whether organized crime is playing the role of divider and conqueror, or whether it's playing the role of the third who benefits while the separatist movement and the host state are going at it, or whether it is playing the role of mediator like the Erneti market. The way that these roles change over time is what I tried to demonstrate is very consequential. And of course, you are right that the typology that you mentioned looks a lot more static and fixed and maybe even a little essentializing. The reason for that is that that's meant for a kind of zoom out, lower resolution, more generalizable typology that is meant to apply across all these cases, whereas the triadic forms and how they evolve, much more dynamic, much more sensitive to changes and to context, and not painting with such a broad brush. And I think those are useful for different purposes depending on how in-depth it's always a trade-off between depth and breadth. That's how I think about it. And you're absolutely right that the one that's aimed at breadth looks a lot more static. Institutional isomorphism, yes, certainly. Tuareg separatism in Niger, very difficult to imagine from the Tuareg separatism in Mali, including the relation to organized crime, although it diverges in those two countries. Albanian separatism in Macedonia, clearly a spillover effect from the Kosovo story, huge institutional isomorphism. The resource curse, I am not even familiar enough as I should be with that literature. My awareness is that it's very quantitative. It is much more political science quantitative, I would say, than the sort of work I'm doing. And in the book, I am very deferential to the kinds of sophisticated techniques that could do that. And I am very happy to subsume what I'm trying to say about, as you said, control of smuggling routes, the centrality of certain rackets, and other things to some kind of framework that can include that can talk about resource curse. Why separatist movement and not small-scale war and not territorial control or something alternative? I also don't have I'm not one of these kind of theory of everything arguments, nor do I wish to be. So if somebody doesn't, I think it's a perfectly legitimate position to think that separatism is just the wrong scope, the wrong concept to capture Other people prefer insurgencies. Other people prefer the Civil War literature and are very frustrated when organized crime is brought into the Civil War literature in the way that Kalivas wrote in that article about Civil War versus organized crime. Other people prefer to talk about failed states, that this entire thing is just, the scope should be failed states and failing states, and then vis-a-vis that you can talk about. I don't really have, if somebody, I take as granted a kind of a priori that the separatism is a valuable lens. I don't really have a theoretical justification that can satisfy everybody, and I think it's perfectly okay if somebody doesn't accept the separatist category, but would like to go with revolutionary movements or with social movements in general. Maybe it's a story of resource mobilization and social movements, whether they're reformist or revolutionary or this and that, nothing to do with the separatism. I'm okay with that. I think then the book doesn't have very much to say to them, and I'm okay with that. The chicken and the egg, finally, before I move to Professor Collins. Yeah, of course, as Professor Collins said, I think the only mega contextual causal claim that I'm prepared to make, that I open with, and that I also take for granted, not as something to be demonstrated, but something that I just take for granted because it's so prevalent in the literature, is that the only big mega cause of both of these phenomena, both the separatism and the organized crime, is, as Zollberg put it, the reconfiguration of political communities. Big polities breaking up into little things and the ensuing consequences, one of which is organized crime, the other which is separatism. Collapse of empires, of course the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course the French and British imperial models collapsing in Western Africa are a huge part of the contextual explanation for all this stuff. And I am not ready to make a monocausal, kind of a monodirectional causal thing between separatism and organized crime. The way I try to get out of that is to say both of those are, byproducts of the collapse of big empires, big multinational states like Yugoslavia, big things like Soviet Union and the Middle Eastern story as well. Within those two, among those two byproducts, there is an interactive effect. And that's what I try to capture with the triads, and that's what I try to capture with this typology, without meaning to sound like one is going to have causal dominance over the other. I think that's a losing game if we try to go down that route. But in certain cases, Kosovo being perhaps the cleanest one, you can certainly see in certain episodes, organized crime. But you can see, as Professor Collins mentioned, the general notion of people selling arms to the highest bidder is ubiquitous in war, and in the Napoleonic War, and in the Civil War, and in Iraq. And of course, if you pick up Patrick Colburn's book, to name one, on the Sunni revolution and the rise of ISIS and Daesh, you will see many fascinating examples of a kind of catch-22, the central Shia government in Heat and the Haditha electric plant paying Daesh in order to kill its own Shia soldiers because they prefer to maintain the illusion that they are controlling the population in Heat. Meanwhile, the Daesh Islamic State is taxing the salaries that it is receiving from the Shia central government in Baghdad, which is its mortal enemy. It finds a way within the ideology to do zakat, to tax the salaries of the soldiers that are now recruited. So there are all kinds of crazy. The difference is that if you take an episode like that, it would obviously be a mistake to take it uncritically. But my point is that it's possible, if you go through enough of the sources, and if you try to triangulate the evidence and so on, it is possible to differentiate that situation from the situation of the Mana clan in Yemen, which is obviously on a scale and on an impact that is incomparable to every day. Okay.
Danilo.
One final point to guys, please.
We have 20 minutes left, and we have 50 people eager to join the conversation. Okay, so
50 people. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Professor Collins, everything you said is correct, and some of it devastating, and as was Miguel's. The one thing that, if I can just in 2 minutes stands out to me, you didn't quite say this, but when we say they're in it for the money, yes. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I can't tell you how many times people come to me and say, oh, mafias are about the economics. Mafias are about the profit. They are not about the politics. They are not about the power. And frankly, if we take that too far, I find that position just incomprehensible. This goes to Miguel's point about the market logic and the politics logic converge in separatist regions especially. The idea that gangsters are only in it for the money and that they are not interested in power is, the people who say this have never met a gangster. Of course they will seize the opportunity to become ministers. Of course they will seize the opportunity to legalize business, to become president of the state enterprise for this and that. Of course, the KLA leadership is almost entirely overlapping with the organ smuggling racket that was uncovered, is now on trial in the, so the New York Five families are the poorest model I can think of for these societies that we're talking about. The New York Five families are indeed hierarchical. The New York Five families are, the analogy I give, and I'll end with this, the analogy I give to my American colleagues who do organized crime is, imagine if this episode of Lucky Luciano being recruited for a small, trivial, short-lived episode to help against the Nazis in the New York docks. We all know this, and it's a very interesting story, and the commission that emerged, all this is very interesting. Imagine, if you will, that all of a sudden Lucky Luciano becomes a leader of New York City separated from the United States. Not after the war, but during the war, while the Nazis are invading and while the Americans are sitting at Yalta. And furthermore, let's imagine that people are sitting at Yalta, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, and communicating with Lucky Luciano to check in about how he feels about the end of the conflict. Can we imagine that? Could we even imagine Lucky Luciano being a figure who is contributing to decisions about whether we should do Operation Overlord from the north into Europe, or whether we should do periphery pecking with the British and the Churchill in the Mediterranean? It's unimaginable. But those are the kinds of consequential impacts that people like Fikret Abdić had in Bosnia, or the Mana clan in Yemen. This is the, so it's very difficult for us to move to that to these places. That's it. Okay.
Thank you. I know you could go on for much longer, Danilo, because there's such a rich range of issues raised by our two eminent speakers, and both coming out of your text as well as their own from their own experience and work. But we have quite a feast in front of us here and only 20 minutes left, and so let's go straight into our participants and ask who is eager to begin. Do I see any hands? No?
Well, I'll just break the ice here. The reason I bring up the New York Mafia is it's perfectly obvious, you know, as Danilo says, that it's really different. But it also happens to be, I think, one of the most successful, long-lasting organized crime. And I think several reasons for that is that it made it attempted to act as a peace commission, adjudicating the separate, decentralized economic activities of it, and with sort of the implication that if you don't do that, then you run into other kinds of problems. The other thing is that I don't know whether Danilo actually addresses this question tangentially in the book or his remarks. So, but maybe I'll ask you right now, is it really important to have a very powerful top crime organization boss who controls all his subordinates and all economic activities? Is that, if you have that organization, does that make whoever they ally with really successful? Or does it work a lot better if it's highly decentralized? I'm sort of making the argument based heavily on Naylor's work on international smuggling. He's the economist who says it doesn't make any sense for smugglers to be a centralized organization. it works a whole hell of a lot better if you just you let entrepreneurs spring up all the way along the route. Otherwise, it's too easy for somebody to knock you off.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. This is your organizational structure question, and the short answer is no. I'm not prepared to argue all of them are certainly not hierarchical, and what I define them as relatively centralized. And often, if you push me hard enough, I will have to have a concrete kind of case-by-case argument with you about which of these are more centralized, and there will be a lot of nuances. But you're absolutely right that the big set of organized criminal actors is decentralized, and for good reasons of efficiency that you rightly allude to. Within that set, there is a subset of more centralized organized criminal enterprises which are the ones I'm focusing on. And it is not important to have a central figure like one guy, but you know, there is some kind of body that is sometimes it is one person, but even then around this one boss, you have people who he deliberates with and so on. So, but the bigger point about organizational structure, you're absolutely right, and it's a yeah. Sicilian Mafia itself was not as hierarchical as we imagine it. Is the real discovery of the archives. That this model that we have copy pasted onto all organized criminal enterprise. If you look back at the original Sicilian Mafia, it wasn't anything close to hierarchical. It was a kind of patron-client, just as you, Professor Collins, in your piece on patrimonial alliances. It was a patrimonial society, kind of pre-bureaucratic, pre-rationalized, and it was mafiosi merely referred to a position in the cobweb of patron-client relations, and conflicting clans, conflicting families, conflicting factions. Those are the rule, and centralization is the exception.
Yeah.
Sure.
Could you raise your hand if you have a question to ask? I'm looking at here, and anyone from Madden, who's that? Aladdin?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Great. My camera is not working for some reason, so I would like to thank you all for a great talk. Say hi to Danilo. I haven't met him in a while. So my question relates to the question of proxy wars. How does this relate to proxy wars? And is there a differentiation between having strong states as a context within which organized crime operates and weak states? Because to draw on an example from our region, I did a little bit of research on Kosovo case, and the question about why Kosovo erupted in the late 1990s and not in the early 1990s has to do something with the pressure from British and the French on the Albanian government to prevent the eruption of major violence in Kosovo by arresting some of the leaders who were more prone to violence in the 1991, 1992. So my question is, can we assume that organized crime is but a function of these proxy wars within the context of strong states with strong interests?
It depends what you mean by function. I would say my reading of this literature is proxy war in the sense that external exogenous actors are connected to so on. So on the one side, it is undisputably true that all civil wars are transnational. No matter how domestic they look, no matter how endogenous all the causal stuff looks, it never really is, and especially not in separatist contexts where patron states, what I call patron states, are always critical. Foreign military interventions are very common, and sometimes they appear to weigh the scales one way or another. However, that we can kind of begin with. In fact, I do. I take that as I take that as a priori. On the other hand, there is a tendency in the literature to have a kind of over-determinacy, which fixates just on the foreign interventionism. Why did the Houthi Yemen story go the way it did and not the southern movement in Yemen? It's because of the various Saudi Arabia America support $110 billion to Saudis so they can bomb everybody? Why did Kosovo manage independence? Because the US intervened. Why did South Ossetia get as far? Because Russia. And there's a kind of reductionism, which is also, in my view, unwarranted, because the minute you start to look at, there are endogenous mafias that are doing the work that enables those foreign interventions to often have the effects that they do. So I would say the short answer to your question is that proxy wars are obviously important, and I think they are they're not always it's partly also Miguel Centeno's question about where's the boundary with small scale wars versus this. And we would have to look case by case, but I would say that we want to avoid the reductionism that treats mafias merely as byproducts or symptoms, because they really are not. And we want to also avoid denying that the proxy wars are significant for separatist movement success, which would also be absurd.
Thanks a lot, and save a free copy for me.
Okay.
Buy one.
Danilo, okay. Ivan, Mr. Todorov.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. This was very insightful and very interesting, and I'm going to be brief. From the discussion, I have this notion that when we talk about separatist movements, and then we talk about mafia, and then we talk let's say organized crime in US, etc. I have the feeling that, and me coming from Serbia and living through kind of the whole experience is happening here, that sometimes when it comes to separatist movements and the organized crime, here there is a tendency for them to kind of gain power and in a way legitimize themselves into politics. Like Arkan had a party, like KLA leaders are obviously running for prime ministers now, etc., etc. Why do you think, just briefly, I guess this could be a long discussion, why do you think, and do you even think that's a thing, and why could that be a thing?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I think that there's kind of two parts. One is that this revolving door between the gangster mafia classes and politics is because they can, because it only becomes possible, it only becomes so easy in regions that have this major competitor challenging the legitimacy of the state, and furthermore creating parallel institutions. There's this institutional parallelism, which I guess is the main reason that separatism could have a claim to be a separate thing from reformist movements, revolutionary movements, and your ordinary wars, because not all wars that want to seize state power and that want to replace one kind of regime with another, and many revolutionary wars are merely like that, are not necessarily the same ones that want to, so to speak, start from scratch and create institutions from scratch, including border institutions. So when gangsters get the opportunity to cleanse themselves, to cleanse their biographies, to legitimize their businesses, it is not just, Pablo Escobar opened up a lot of hospitals and invested tens of millions of dollars and went into parliament and became a parliamentarian, and how interesting that he's suddenly interested in the democratic process, right? So over and above that, there is a tremendous kind of window to create your own state, sometimes in impossible conditions that many of them seize. So this is a kind of seizing the opportunity moment, and I'm not saying it's possible everywhere, nor that it's necessary anywhere, but in these regions, it's especially, in separatist torn states, it's especially likely. The second part of the answer to your question is there is a pool of people, and this is the part we know from kind of the ethnographies of gangs and mafias everywhere, whether it's favelas in Brazil or Russian gangs or the Serbian gangs, neighborhood gangs that you mentioned, Ivan, that I am also very familiar with biographically, right? The one thing they all have in common is that it's a story of men between kind of puberty and 25 years old who are pursuing, it's not just a material profit story. Why are they going into this? It's a story of a model of masculinity. It's a story of social mobility. It's a story of role models for how to advance in the community, in the locality, how to get a sense of respect, how to get a sense of dignity, how to be somebody and to have the kind of protection so that not everybody can beat you up all the time. And I mentioned the Boko Haram, how about not starving, is also an excellent reason for your youth gang to take on a certain national ideological component, right? So on the policy side, of course, the big solution is prevention. The big solution is for these places to create, for these young people, for these young men, alternative models of social mobility, alternative models of masculinity, alternative avenues to success and social mobility inside the community that look just as credible as the local gang.
Bart had to leave. He left a note here. This is a terrific exchange and a terrific book. But he also adds that in response to Miguel saying he would be terrified if he was on your committee for your safety. Bart added, we were. We all, me less so, coming from and working in a society which is among the top 5 most violent in the world. I could take it with more equanimity, but yes, we were very concerned. Mr. Schwartz, David Schwartz, I mean, did you, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here, yeah.
And you had a comment here, did you want to raise it?
Sure. I just had a very simplistic take on the presentation, which was which I thoroughly enjoyed, Danilo. But I get the impression that what's going on is a kind of accelerated deprivation of the general populations by the globalization processes, and that these mafia and mafia-like organizations are filling a kind of deprived void of social services. Would you that the governments are unable to fulfill because of the globalization processes?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what your reaction to that description might be.
Point.
So briefly, I'm a bit of a skeptic, even though globalization appears in my subtitle. I am a bit of a skeptic as to the extent to which globalization has changed organized crime. There is a debate within this field between what we might call the nothing is new under the sun school of thought, which someone like Phil Williams or other people who point out that we shouldn't rush to exaggerate what globalization has done to transnational smuggling, for example, or to organizational structure of mafias that Professor Collins alluded to. On the other side, there are arguments of the kind of Misha Glenny, McMafia. This is something new. This is a new monster transnationalism perspective, which have some. There's some conjectures from that quarter that are also important, and I'm somewhere in between. But on the whole, I'm a little skeptical about this notion that mafias have been transformed forever.
Danilo, I'm interested in the issue of gangsterism, as you know, coming from a country that is, and studying a country that's rife with political gangsterism. The extent to which this is related to failed, or not even failed, quite often thriving democracies in which the patron-client relationship becomes an essential part of political survival, in especially during the election process, which almost sort of generates this kind of relationship. In the case of Jamaica, which, as I mentioned earlier, now is rampant with crime, the whole thing was started by the politicians using gangs to generate votes and generate sort of political loyalty. The system then grew and got out of hand as the gangs they formed became more and more mature, if you like, and increasingly saw their own power. But worst of all, linking up with international drug gangs and becoming powerful independent forces themselves. And then you had the tables turning in which the gangs who were once dependent on the politician for patronage, for survival, now become the people who were the sponsors of the politician because they were wealthier than they were from the money coming in internationally. And one finds this over and over in sort of, and this is a direct result of the democratic process of having to generate votes, generate political loyalty in the constituencies. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, one is likely to see more and more of this, ironically, coming out of the very attempt at the democratic transition. And it may well be a function of transitional democracies before they become mature. There's a sense, I suspect, that late 19th century America, this is in which politics was notoriously violent and subject to these kind of forces. I often wonder whether this is not closely related to one of the dark sides of democracy, so to speak.
Yeah, Orlando, I think you're echoing. I defer to these specialists like Varese, who wrote Mafias on the Move, and he makes this point very explicitly about the sudden transitions to democracy, coupled with sudden transitions to something that's supposed to be free market capitalism, or the abolition of serfdom overnight, as happened in Sicily. He notes that, of course, the organized criminal reaction is to say, oh, votes are just another commodity that we can build a racket around. And so of course, Sicily was like this too. The story of Sicily getting incorporated into centralized Italy was in no small part a story of some Christian Democratic Party of so-and-so comes down to the Sicilian patrimonial mafias, and the patrimonial ask, how many, tell us how many votes you need and how many votes you need from each person to vote multiple times, and we'll strike it. And so it sounds like the Caribbean had its own example. Yeah. Another excellent source on this is that old, for all his Marxist orthodoxies, but Eric Hobsbawm's book on social banditry, which has several chapters on mafia and Sicily and beyond, also really fleshes out this point that democracy, but maybe we should call it electoral parliamentarism in particular, when it rubs up against this very entrenched mafia patrimonialism, has this pattern you're talking about.
Thank you, Danilo. We could go on for much longer, but we've reached the end of our time. You started us off with flying colors. Thank you very much for a wonderful book. I'm proud of the fact that I had something to do in its very early stages, and I look forward to the reviews. Thank you all for participating in our first session of the semester. I look forward to seeing you again. Well, the next session I'll be on talking about what I've been doing over the last several months. I've sort of changed course quite radically, working as the chair of a commission for the radical reform of the Jamaican educational system. It's not often that sociologists are given this opportunity. And I'll be talking about the work we've been doing over there. So thanks for coming, and have a good day, and stay safe, please. Miguel, thank you very much. Randall, thank you so much for taking time off to do this. We appreciate it very much. Bye.